The Royal Opera House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles on that April evening in 1858, each flame multiplied in the gilt mirrors that lined the crimson walls, transforming the theatre into a glittering palace of judgment where London's finest had gathered to witness not merely Verdi's La Traviata, but the final humiliation of Miss Arabella Fairfax. She sat alone in box 7 on the second tier, her spine rigid against the red velvet cushions, her gloved hands clutching the mother-of-pearl opera glasses so tightly that her knuckles had gone white beneath the silk. The box that should have held her parents, her younger sister, perhaps an aunt or two, stood conspicuously empty except for her solitary figure, a testament to the scandal that had been brewing for 3 weeks since that fateful evening at Lady Pemberton's political salon, where Arabella had committed the unforgivable sin of possessing and voicing an opinion. The air in the opera house was thick with expensive perfumes, the cloying scent of hothouse roses, the waxy smell of candles burning in their crystal sconces, and beneath it all, the sharp metallic tang of her own fear. Below on the stage, Violetta was singing of love and sacrifice, the soprano's voice soaring toward the painted ceiling where cherubs frolicked in eternal spring. But Arabella heard none of it, for her attention was fixed with horrible fascination on the figure now ascending the small set of stairs at the side of the stage. Lord Thomas Gardiner, her former betrothed, the man who had courted her for 6 months with what she had foolishly believed was genuine affection, now stood in the spotlight looking resplendent in his evening clothes, his fair hair gleaming gold, his handsome face arranged in an expression of dignified pleasure. The conductor had paused the performance, the orchestra falling silent as Lord Gardiner raised his hand to address the assembly, and Arabella felt the world begin to tilt on its axis. "It is my great honor," Lord Gardiner's voice rang out across the hushed theatre, "to announce my betrothal to the charming Miss Lydia Fairfax, whose gentle disposition and proper demeanour represent the finest qualities of English womanhood." The words struck Arabella like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to wound, for everyone present understood the implicit contrast being drawn. Lydia, her own cousin, her father's brother's daughter, was everything Arabella was not. Young at 19, sweetly compliant, pretty in a conventional way with golden ringlets and china blue eyes, and most importantly, she had never expressed an opinion on anything more controversial than the weather. The applause that erupted was deafening, a roar of approval that seemed to shake the very foundations of the opera house. And as one, the assembled audience turned to look up at box 7, where Arabella sat exposed in her solitude. She could feel their eyes upon her, hundreds of gazes ranging from pitying to gleeful, all finding her alone in the box that should have held her family, but stood empty because her parents had refused to attend, too ashamed of their outspoken daughter to show their faces in society. From the adjacent box, voices carried clearly through the thin partition, not even bothering to lower their tones. "Poor Arabella Fairfax," a woman's voice dripped with false sympathy, "to be cast aside for her own cousin. They say she argued with Lord Gardiner about women's education at the Pemberton salon. Can you imagine? A woman arguing with her betrothed about politics. No man wants a wife who thinks herself his equal." Another voice joined in, this one male and dismissive. "At 28, she will not recover from this. Her outspoken nature has finally cost her everything. First the engagement, now her family's regard. I heard Lord Fairfax himself said she had brought shame upon their house." Arabella's breath was coming in short gasps now, her corset suddenly impossibly tight, the boning digging into her ribs as her chest heaved. The theatre seemed to be spinning, the 3 tiers of boxes blurring together into a dizzying spiral of red and gold, faces leering down at her from every direction. She had known this moment was coming, had steeled herself for it ever since the rumours began circulating that Lord Gardiner had transferred his attentions to Lydia. But knowing and experiencing were vastly different things. To sit here alone while he proclaimed his love for her cousin, to hear him praise the very qualities that were the opposite of everything Arabella was, to feel the weight of society's judgment crushing down upon her like a physical force. It was more than she could bear. Her vision began to darken at the edges, grey creeping in like fog on the Thames, and she knew with distant clarity that she was about to faint. Through the gathering darkness, she became aware of another gaze, different from the mocking stares of the crowd. Across the theatre, in one of the most prominent boxes, sat the Duke of Wentworth, Frederick Wentworth, a man she had never spoken to, but knew by reputation as London's most eligible bachelor and most confirmed recluse. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something intense and focused in his grey-blue eyes that seemed to see past the spectacle to the woman beneath. His face was all sharp angles and aristocratic planes, his dark hair swept back from a high forehead, his tall frame elegant in perfectly tailored evening clothes. For a moment their eyes met across the glittering expanse of the opera house, and Arabella felt something shift in her chest, though whether it was her heart or simply the tightening of her stays, she could not say. Then the darkness claimed her completely. The opera glasses slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering against the brass rail of the box, before tumbling to the carpeted floor with a muffled thud. Arabella's body swayed, her carefully arranged dark hair coming, loose from its pins as her head lolled back against the velvet cushions. Her last conscious thought, bitter and despairing, echoed through her fading mind. Even here, in the darknesses, I am exposed. The sounds of the opera house faded to a distant roar, the applause for Lord Gardiner's announcement still thundering through the air, mixing with the whispers and gasps as people noticed Miss Fairfax collapsing in her lonely box. Someone called for smelling salts, another for a doctor, but their voices seemed to come from very far away, as though Arabella were sinking beneath deep water. The scent of candle wax and perfume gave way to nothing, blessed nothing, as unconsciousness swept over her like a dark tide. She was aware, dimly, of footsteps outside the box, of voices raised in concern, or perhaps merely curiosity, of the rustle of silk and the creak of the door opening. But she could not rouse herself, could not force her eyes to open, could not do anything but lie there against the cushions like a broken doll, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, her face pale as marble in the golden gaslight. On stage, the performance had resumed. Violetta's aria continuing as though nothing had happened, for what was one woman's collapse compared to the grand drama of the opera? Lord Gardiner had descended from his moment of triumph and now sat in his own box beside Lydia, who looked simultaneously pleased and guilty, her small hand resting in his as they watched the stage. Around them, London society settled back into their seats, already composing the letters they would write tomorrow, the calls they would make, spreading the delicious gossip of Miss Arabella Fairfax's public humiliation and dramatic collapse. But in Box 7, something was beginning that none of them could have anticipated, for Frederick Wentworth, Duke of Wentworth, had risen from his seat with a sudden decision. He had been watching Miss Fairfax all evening, had seen the rigid control in her posture, the way her hands gripped the opera glasses as though they were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. He had attended the Pemberton Salon 3 weeks ago, had stood in the back of the crowded drawing room and listened as she spoke with passionate eloquence about the need for women's access to education, quoting Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill with equal facility, her eyes blazing with conviction. He had watched Lord Gardiner's face grow progressively more furious as his betrothed refused to back down from her arguments, and he had known then that the engagement was doomed. What he had not anticipated was this public cruelty, this deliberate choice to announce a new betrothal in the very place where Miss Fairfax would be most exposed and most alone. The calculated malice of it had stirred something in Frederick that he had thought long dead, a fury at injustice that he had learned to suppress during his years in Parliament, watching greater and lesser men alike crush those who dared to challenge convention. But watching Arabella Fairfax collapse, seeing her crumple like a flower beneath too heavy a frost, he found he could suppress it no longer. He murmured a brief excuse to his sister Henrietta, who sat beside him, her eyes wide with concern, and then he was moving, striding from his box with long, purposeful steps, his evening cape swirling behind him. Other gentlemen might send a servant, might wait for someone else to respond to a lady's distress, but Frederick Wentworth had never been like other gentlemen, and he had no intention of leaving Arabella Fairfax to the tender mercies of the gossiping masses who even now were craning their necks to get a better view of her unconscious form. The corridor outside the boxes was a chaos of movement, ushers rushing about, several matrons exclaiming loudly about the shocking scene, gentlemen standing in clusters discussing whether someone should fetch Lord Fairfax, though everyone knew he had not attended. Frederick ignored them all, his destination fixed, his purpose clear. He reached box 7 just as a flustered usher was fumbling with the door handle, and with a single look, Frederick dismissed the man, entering the box alone and closing the door firmly behind him. The lock turned with a decisive click as he pocketed the key, and finally, in the sudden quiet, he turned to look at the woman who had occupied his thoughts for 3 weeks, the woman whose words had awakened something in him that he had believed forever dormant. Consciousness returned to Arabella in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror slowly reassembling themselves into a coherent whole. First came awareness of the velvet cushions beneath her, softer now than she remembered, and then the realization that she was no longer slumped awkwardly against the side of the box, but seated properly in one of the gilt chairs, her head supported by what felt like a folded evening cape. The scent reached her next, sandalwood, and something else, something distinctly masculine that cut through the cloying perfumes and candle wax that had overwhelmed her before. Her eyelids fluttered open, and the world swam into focus, the golden gaslight of the opera house seeming dimmer now, more intimate, and with a jolt of alarm she realized she was no longer alone. The Duke of Wentworth knelt beside her chair, his tall frame folded with surprising grace, one knee touching the carpeted floor of the box, while the other supported his weight. In his hand he held a crystal glass of water, the liquid catching the candlelight and throwing prismatic reflections across his aristocratic features. His grey-blue eyes, intent and unwavering, were fixed upon her face with an expression that sent a tremor through her already weakened body. Arabella's first instinct was to bolt upright, to flee, but her limbs felt heavy and uncooperative, her corset still too tight though someone had loosened the ribbons at her throat. "Your Grace," she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse and trembling. "You should not be here. If we are discovered, I shall be utterly ruined." The words came automatically, drilled into her by years of social conditioning, even as her mind registered the absurdity of worrying about propriety when her reputation lay already in tatters on the opera house floor. Frederick Wentworth's expression did not change, though something flickered in those winter sea eyes, something that might have been amusement or might have been anger. She could not tell. He extended the glass toward her with steady hands, though she noticed the tension in his jaw, the white line around his compressed lips that spoke of fury held rigidly in check. "You are already ruined in their eyes, are you not?" he said quietly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. "What is the worth of a society that punishes intelligence and rewards vapid compliance? I learned long ago that the tone's approval is worthless currency." The words struck her with almost physical force, not because they were cruel, but because they were true, because they gave voice to thoughts she had harbored in secret for years, but never dared speak aloud. She took the glass from him with trembling fingers, their hands not quite touching, though she felt the heat of his skin through her gloves. As she raised the water to her lips, desperately thirsty, she watched him over the rim of the glass, trying to understand what was happening. The Duke of Wentworth was kneeling in her opera box, had somehow moved her from the floor to the chair, had locked the door, she now noticed with a fresh surge of panic, and was looking at her not with pity or derision, but with something that looked remarkably like admiration. Outside the box, the sounds of intermission swirled in a chaotic symphony of laughter and gossip and hurrying footsteps. She could hear voices discussing her collapse, ladies speculating about whether she had done it deliberately for attention, gentlemen wagering on whether Lord Fairfax would send her to the country in disgrace. A sharp knock sounded at the door, and an usher's anxious voice called out, "Miss Fairfax, are you quite well? Shall I fetch a physician?" Frederick did not even turn his head, his gaze remaining locked on Arabella's face as he completely ignored the interruption. After a moment, the footsteps retreated, though she could hear the usher muttering to someone about locked doors and propriety. "I watched them circle you like ravens, Miss Fairfax," Frederick said, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut. "I will not permit them to pick your bones while you are still breathing." Arabella set the glass down on the small table beside the chair with a click that seemed too loud in the confined space. The box felt smaller now, with both of them inside it, more intimate, the walls pressing in until the world seemed to have contracted to just this gilded cage, suspended above the empty. Below, the curtain was drawn for intermission, creating an odd sense of suspension, as though time itself had paused. "Why do you care what happens to me?" she asked, and was proud that her voice came out stronger now, less shaking. "We have never even been properly introduced." It was true. They moved in overlapping but distinct social circles. She a mere gentleman's daughter, while he was a duke, one of the most powerful men in England, sought after by every matchmaking mamma with a daughter to dispose of, and yet remaining resolutely unmarried at 36. She knew of him by reputation only, had heard whispers of his brilliance in Parliament, his vast estates, his preference for intellectual pursuits over social ones, but they had never exchanged so much as a word. Frederick reached up and began removing his evening gloves, peeling the soft leather from his long fingers with deliberate precision. The gesture was shockingly intimate, the kind of thing a man did in private, not in company, and Arabella felt heat rise to her cheeks as she watched. When his hands were bare, he offered one to her, palm up, an invitation rather than a command. "Allow me to help you sit up properly," he said. "You are still pale, and I fear you might faint again if you move too quickly." She hesitated only a moment before placing her gloved hand in his bare one, feeling the warmth of his skin through the thin silk. His grip was firm but gentle as he helped her shift in the chair, adjusting the cape behind her head so she could sit more upright. When he was satisfied with her position, he settled back on his heels, but did not release her hand, and she found she did not want him to. "I heard every word you spoke at the Pemberton salon 3 weeks ago," he said, and there was something in his voice now that she had not heard before, something raw and honest that cut through all the layers of aristocratic reserve. "Your argument for women's access to university education was the most compelling speech I have heard in a decade of parliamentary sessions. Gardiner is a fool who never deserved your brilliance." A dark smile curved his lips, transforming his austere features into something almost dangerous. Arabella stared at him, her mind struggling to process this revelation. He had been there, at the salon, had heard her speak. She tried to remember the crowd that night, the faces that had watched as she stood in Lady Pemberton's drawing-room and dared to argue that women possessed the same capacity for learning as men, that denying them education was a crime against half of humanity. She had been so focused on marshalling her arguments, on responding to the objections that Lord Gardiner and others had raised, that she had not paid attention to who else might be listening. The memory of that evening was seared into her mind, not just for the intellectual exhilaration she had felt in finally voicing her beliefs, but for what had come after, the cold fury in Lord Gardiner's eyes, the way he had escorted her home in icy silence, the letter that had arrived 2 days later breaking their engagement on the grounds of incompatibility of temperament. "You were there," she said, and it was not quite a question. "I did not see you." I stood in the back, Frederick replied, his thumb moving in small circles against her palm, in a gesture she suspected he was not even aware of. I had been dragged to the event by my sister Henrietta, who insists on trying to civilize me by forcing me into society. I was prepared to be bored beyond endurance. Instead, I watched you stand before a room full of men who were determined to dismiss you and refuse to be diminished. You quoted Wollstonecraft and Mill. You cited statistics on literacy rates and economic productivity. You made logical arguments that no one could refute, so instead they attacked your femininity, your propriety, your right to even hold an opinion. And through it all, you did not back down. His eyes had darkened, the grey-blue deepening to something like storm clouds over the ocean. I have sat through countless parliamentary debates where lesser minds than yours drone on for hours about matters they barely understand, and they are celebrated for their eloquence while you are punished for your intelligence. It is an obscenity. Arabella felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness but from the shocking relief of being seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time in her life. Her parents loved her. She did not doubt that, but they had always viewed her quick mind and voracious reading habits as obstacles to overcome, problems to be managed rather than gifts to be celebrated. Lord Gardiner had initially seemed charmed by her wit, but had quickly grown resentful when he realized she would not simply parrot his opinions back to him, and society at large had made its judgment clear tonight, applauding her replacement with a younger, prettier, more compliant version. But here was the Duke of Wentworth, a man she had never spoken to, telling her that her intelligence was not a flaw but a virtue, that her refusal to be silenced was not shameful but admirable. "Please, Miss Fairfax," he said softly, and she realized she had begun to rise from the chair, her body instinctively preparing to flee this intimacy that felt too raw, too dangerous. "Give me 5 minutes. If after that you still wish to face the vultures outside, I will unlock the door myself." His hand still held hers, warm and solid, an anchor in the chaos of her churning emotions. She sank back into the chair, her body making the decision before her mind could catch up, and nodded. The candlelight in the box flickered as a draught from somewhere made the flames dance, sending shadows racing across the walls, across his face, hiding and revealing by turns the intensity of his expression. Around them, the opera house hummed with intermission activity, hundreds of people laughing and gossiping and drinking champagne, completely unaware of the scene, unfolding in box 7. 5 minutes, she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you must tell me why. Why you are here. Why you locked the door. Why you care about a woman who is, as you yourself said, already ruined." Frederick released her hand and sat back on his heels, studying her with that same unwavering focus that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. "The truth is, Miss Fairfax, I have been searching for you." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and yet undeniable. Searching for her. For 3 weeks, while her world crumbled and her engagement dissolved and her family withdrew their support, the Duke of Wentworth had been searching for her. "After the salon, I asked Lady Pemberton who you were," he continued. "She told me your name, mentioned your engagement to Lord Gardiner, and I confess I felt a stab of disappointment. But then the rumors began to circulate, whispers that the engagement had been broken, and I found myself hoping." His jaw tightened again, that flash of fury returning. "Not hoping that you would suffer, never that, but hoping that perhaps you might be free of a man who was so clearly unworthy of you. My sister Henrietta made inquiries, discovered that you would be attending the opera tonight. I had intended to approach you during intermission, to request a proper introduction, to ask permission to call upon you." He gestured around the box with one hand, his expression grim. "I did not anticipate this public execution. The announcement from the stage, the deliberate cruelty of choosing your own cousin, the way they all stared at you like spectators at a bear baiting. When I saw you collapse, I knew I could not leave you to their mercy, for they have none." Arabella was trembling now, though whether from the aftermath of her faint, or from his proximity, or from the sheer overwhelming impossibility of what he was saying, she could not determine. "You locked the door," she said, grasping at the practical detail because the emotional implications were too vast to contemplate. "You created a scandal to prevent a scandal." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I created a sanctuary," he corrected gently. "Out there, you are prey. In here, for these 5 minutes, you are safe. And when we emerge, if we emerge together, the scandal will be of an entirely different nature. One I am prepared to weather if you are." She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception or pity or the kind of misguided chivalry that would doom them both, but found only steady determination and something else, something that looked like hope. The scent of his sandalwood cologne mingled with the roses that sat in a vase on the small table, creating an olfactory memory she knew would haunt her forever. This moment suspended in time, when the Duke of Wentworth knelt before her in a locked opera box and offered her not rescue, but recognition, not salvation, but solidarity. "Your 5 minutes are not yet up," she said quietly, and watched as relief and something fiercer flashed across his features. "Then allow me to use them wisely," he replied, and began to speak. The opera had resumed beyond the walls of Box 7, the orchestra swelling with the opening notes of Act 3, and through the gilded partition Arabella could hear Violetta beginning her aria, Addio del passato, farewell to the past, the soprano's voice rising in heartbreaking lament for dreams that would never be realized, for a life that was slipping away like water through desperate fingers. The timing was so poignant, so perfectly aligned with the devastation of her own circumstances, that Arabella might have laughed if she had not been so close to tears, if the Duke of Wentworth had not been watching her with those winter-sea eyes that seemed to perceive every thought flickering across her features. She watched, transfixed, as Frederick shifted his position with deliberate care, moving from his previous crouch to a full kneel before her chair, one knee and then the other touching the carpeted floor of the box, until his tall frame was folded in a posture of supplication that sent shock rippling through her body like lightning through water. No man had ever knelt to her except in the mockery of a country dance, and even then only briefly, a prescribed movement in the formal choreography of courtship. This was something else entirely. This was the Duke of Wentworth, one of the most powerful men in England, a man who commanded vast estates and wielded influence in Parliament, a man before whom lesser nobles bowed and scraped, lowering himself before a ruined woman in a locked opera box while scandal brewed like a storm beyond the door. His hands rested on his knee, carefully positioned where she could see them, making no move to reach for her without permission, and the restraint in that gesture spoke volumes about the control he was exerting over himself. Arabella's fingers twisted in her lap, the silk of her gloves bunching and smoothing as her hands betrayed the turmoil her face struggled to conceal. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to wrench open the locked door and run from this impossible intimacy, from the way he was looking at her as though she were something precious rather than something spoiled. But another part of her, the part that had stood in Lady Pemberton's drawing room and refused to be silenced, the part that had clutched those opera glasses and endured the stares of 1,000 judging eyes, that part wanted desperately to stay, to hear what he would say next, to understand what possible purpose could be served by the Duke of Wentworth kneeling before her like a supplicant before an altar. "I am kneeling, Miss Fairfax," Frederick said, his voice low and intense, "because society has spent your entire life forcing you to diminish yourself. I will not tower over you while asking what I am about to ask." The words struck her like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true, because he had articulated something she had never quite put into words herself, the constant pressure to be smaller, quieter, less intelligent, less opinionated, less everything that made her herself. She had spent 28 years folding herself into shapes that would fit into drawing rooms and ballrooms, trimming away the parts of herself that society deemed excessive. And still it had not been enough. Still she had been found wanting, found unsuitable, found too much despite all her efforts to be less. "What could you possibly ask of me?" she heard herself say, and was startled by how breathless her voice sounded, how young and uncertain. "I have nothing left. My reputation, my engagement, my family's regard, all gone." She gestured vaguely toward the door, toward the world beyond where her name was doubtless being dragged through the mud of London gossip, where Lord Gardiner and sweet, compliant Lydia were being congratulated on their excellent match, where her parents were likely receiving condolences on their difficult daughter as though she had died rather than simply failed to conform. What could the Duke of Wentworth possibly want from a woman who had nothing to offer, who was damaged goods in the marriage market, who would bring nothing but scandal to any association? "You have your mind," Frederick said, and the certainty in his voice made her breath catch. "Your convictions, your courage, these are not nothing. They are everything." He paused, his grey-blue eyes never leaving her face, and she could see him gathering himself for whatever came next, could see the tension in his shoulders, the set of his jaw. "I am kneeling because I wish to ask permission to court you, openly, before all of London." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and crystalline, and for a long moment Arabella could do nothing but stare at him. Court her, openly, before all of London. The Duke of Wentworth, the most eligible bachelor in England, the man who had rejected countless beautiful, well-connected young women, wanted to court her, the scandalous, outspoken, ruined Miss Arabella Fairfax. A laugh bubbled up from her chest, half hysteria and half disbelief, escaping her lips before she could stop it. "You are mad," she said, shaking her head as though she could physically dislodge the absurdity of what he was proposing. "Your Grace, you are the most sought-after bachelor in England. You could have any woman, young, beautiful, properly behaved. Why would you shackle yourself to scandal for someone like me? Someone who argues about politics and quotes philosophy and cannot seem to keep her opinions to herself, no matter how many times she is told that such behavior is unbecoming. Someone who is 28 and outspoken and has just been publicly humiliated by her own cousin." The catalogue of her flaws felt endless, each one a weight she had carried for so long that she had almost forgotten they were supposed to be defects, rather than simply facts of her existence. Frederick's expression did not change, though something softened around his eyes, something that might have been tenderness or might have been understanding. "I do not want any woman," he said quietly. "I want the woman who stood in Lady Pemberton's drawing-room and argued that intelligence has no gender, who quoted Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill in the same breath, who made me feel, for the first time in a decade of drawing-room conversations, that I was not alone in seeing the world's absurdities." His hands remained on his knee, but she could see the tension in his fingers, the way they pressed into the fabric of his evening trousers, as though he were physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "I have spent years watching men of inferior intellect pontificate about matters they barely comprehend, while brilliant women are forced to smile and nod and pretend they have no thoughts of their own. I have watched society celebrate mediocrity in men while punishing excellence in women, and I have been complicit in it by my silence, by my withdrawal from the social world, by my refusal to challenge the status quo. But then I heard you speak, and something in me, something I thought had died years ago when I lost my father and inherited a title I never wanted, that something woke up." Tears were forming in Arabella's eyes now, blurring her vision so that Frederick's kneeling form seemed to waver in the candlelight, like a mirage that might vanish if she blinked. "You would shackle yourself to scandal for a woman you have never even spoken to," she whispered, and it was the closest she had come to asking him why, really why, not the intellectual arguments, but the emotional truth beneath them. What could possibly motivate such madness, such willingness to overturn his entire life for someone he did not know? "Spoken to, no," Frederick acknowledged, and now there was something raw in his voice, something unguarded that made her heart clench in her chest. "But I have listened to you, and I find I cannot stop. For 3 weeks I have thought of nothing else. The way you stood there refusing to be cowed, the passion in your voice when you spoke of women denied education, the logic of your arguments that no one could refute, so they attacked your character instead. I have replayed that evening in my mind until I can recite every word you spoke, every gesture you made. And I realized that I have been waiting my entire life for someone who would challenge me, who would match me, who would refuse to be diminished for my comfort or anyone else's." The aria beyond the walls swelled to its climax, Violetta's voice soaring in desperate beauty, singing of past dreams and present sorrows, and the music seemed to underscore the surreal intimacy of the moment, this confession unfolding in a locked opera box while the world outside continued its relentless judgment. Arabella could hear footsteps in the corridor beyond, voices raised in speculation and gossip, the intermission crowd returning to their seats for the final act, and she knew that every moment she remained here with Frederick, alone and unchaperoned behind a locked door, was another nail in the coffin of her reputation. And yet she could not bring herself to care, not when he was kneeling before her like a devotee before a shrine, not when he was offering her something she had never dared hope for, recognition of her worth exactly as she was rather than as society demanded she be. She studied his face, searching for any trace of deception or pity or misguided chivalry, looking for the crack in his composure that would reveal this to be some elaborate joke or fever dream. But his expression remained steady, open, vulnerable in a way she suspected few people ever saw the Duke of Wentworth, and in his eyes she saw not pity but fury, the same controlled rage she had glimpsed earlier when he spoke of watching them circle her like ravens. He was angry on her behalf, angry at a society that would punish intelligence and courage, angry at Lord Gardiner for his public cruelty, angry at a world that had forced her to spend 28 years diminishing herself. And beneath the anger, barely visible but unmistakable once she recognized it, was something that looked remarkably like hope. "I do not understand," Arabella said finally, her voice trembling. "You speak of listening to me as though it were some revelation, but men have listened to me before. They have listened, and then they have told me I am too outspoken, too opinionated, too intense. Lord Gardiner listened to me for 6 months, and then decided he preferred my cousin, who never expresses an opinion stronger than a preference for roses over lilies. What makes you different? What makes you believe that you will not grow tired of my arguments, that you will not eventually wish for a quieter, more compliant wife?" The word wife had slipped out before she could stop it, presumptuous and revealing, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks. Frederick's lips curved in a slight smile, not mocking, but genuine, as though her slip had pleased him rather than embarrassed them both. "What makes me different?" he repeated slowly, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I suppose the answer is that I do not want to be comfortable, Miss Fairfax. I have been comfortable for years, surrounded by people who agree with everything I say, who treat my words as though they were handed down from on high simply because I have a title and wealth and power. It is suffocating. It is soul-destroying. It has made me into someone I barely recognize, someone who hides in his estates and avoids society because he cannot bear one more vapid conversation about the weather or the latest fashions. But when I heard you speak, when I watched you refuse to back down even as the room turned against you, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt alive." He shifted slightly, adjusting his position without rising, keeping himself at her eye level, keeping himself in that posture of supplication that was transforming this conversation from a mere request into something sacred. "You asked what I could possibly want from you when you have nothing left," he continued. "But you have everything wrong, Miss Fairfax. You think your reputation is destroyed, and perhaps by society's narrow standards it is. You think your family's regard is lost, and perhaps that is true as well, though any family that would withdraw their love because you dared to think for yourself is not worthy of your grief. You think you have nothing to offer, but the truth is you have everything. You have a mind that challenges and provokes and refuses to accept easy answers. You have convictions that you are willing to defend even when it costs you dearly. You have courage enough to stand alone in an opera box and endure the judgment of hundreds. These are not flaws to be overcome, they are gifts to be celebrated. And I want to spend my life celebrating them, if you will permit me." The candlelight flickered again, sending shadows dancing across his features, and Arabella realized that the box had become a confessional, a sacred space separated from the ordinary world where truth could be spoken without the usual masks and performances that society demanded. Outside, the scandal was brewing. People were speculating about what was happening behind the locked door of Box 7. Reputations were being shredded and reassembled in the gossip mills of London. But inside, something new was beginning, something that had nothing to do with society's rules and everything to do with two people recognizing in each other a kindred spirit, a fellow X from the suffocating conformity of the ton. "But this is madness," Arabella whispered, though she could hear the weakening in her own protest, the way her objections were crumbling beneath the steady weight of his certainty. "You would court me openly, you said. Do you understand what that means? The gossip, the speculation, the way people will talk. They will say I have ensnared you somehow, that I am using feminine wiles to trap a duke into marriage. They will say you are mad or bewitched or suffering from some temporary insanity. Your friends will counsel you against it, your family will object, and every matchmaking mamma in London will see me as the enemy who stole their prize." "Let them talk," Frederick said, and there was steel in his voice now, the voice of a man who had commanded estates and made decisions in Parliament that affected thousands. "Let them speculate and gossip and invent whatever fantasies please them. I stopped caring about their opinions years ago, Miss Fairfax. The only opinion that matters to me in this moment is yours. Do you want me to court you? Not because it is proper or expected or because you have no other options, but because you want it. Because you feel even a fraction of what I feel. This sense that I have finally found someone who sees the world as I do, who will not accept injustice simply because it is traditional, who will challenge me and argue with me and make me think. That is what I am asking, not for your gratitude or your resignation to circumstances, but for your genuine desire to embark on this journey together." Arabella's breath caught in her throat as she absorbed the full weight of what he was offering. Not rescue, but partnership. Not salvation, but solidarity. Through the walls, Violetta's aria came to its tragic conclusion, the final notes hanging in the air like a benediction or a warning. Farewell to the past, indeed. And Arabella understood that she stood at a crossroads, that her answer to Frederick's question would determine not just the next weeks or months, but the entire trajectory of her life. She could refuse, could insist that he unlock the door and leave her to face the consequences of tonight's humiliation alone, could retreat to her family's country estate and live out her days as the cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about the dangers of being too clever. Or she could take the hand he was offering, could step into this impossible scandal and make of it something transformative, could stop apologizing for her intelligence and start celebrating it. Her fingers had stopped their nervous twisting and now lay still in her lap, and she realized that despite the chaos of the evening, despite the feint and the humiliation and the locked door, she felt calmer than she had in weeks, as though some fundamental question had finally been answered. Frederick rose from his kneeling position with fluid grace, retrieving the key from his waistcoat pocket and turning it in the lock with a decisive click that seemed to echo through the small space like a gunshot. The sound of the mechanism disengaging brought reality crashing back into their intimate sanctuary. The muffled roar of intermission conversation suddenly sharp and immediate, and Arabella felt panic surge through her veins like ice water. Her instinct, honed by 28 years of social conditioning, screamed at her to flee, to slip out through whatever side entrance she could find, and disappear into the London night before anyone could see her emerging from a locked box with the Duke of Wentworth, before the scandal could solidify into something permanent and inescapable. She rose from the chair on trembling legs, her hand reaching for the door handle, but Frederick moved to block her path without actually touching her, his tall frame filling the narrow space between her and escape. "You may leave alone through the side entrance," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the intensity burning in his grey-blue eyes. "Or you may walk with me to my box, where my sister awaits, and sit with my family for the final act. The choice is entirely yours, Miss Fairfax. I will not compel you, but I will tell you this. If you walk away now, you will be walking away alone, and they will interpret your solitary departure as shame, as an admission that something illicit occurred here. But if you take my arm, if you walk with me through those doors and sit in the most prominent box in this theatre, you will be making a statement that you have nothing to be ashamed of, that you choose to associate with me as openly as I choose to associate with you." The words hung between them like a challenge and an invitation, and Arabella understood that this was the true test, not the private confession in the locked box, but this public declaration, this moment where she would either retreat into the shadows or step into the blazing light of society's judgment and dare them to look away. Her whole body was shaking now, fear and exhilaration warring in her chest until she could barely breathe. But beneath the terror was something else, something that had been growing since Frederick first knelt before her and told her that her mind and courage and convictions were everything. It was exhaustion, bone-deep and soul-weary, the accumulated weight of years spent diminishing herself, making herself smaller and quieter and less threatening. Apologizing for her intelligence and hiding her opinions and pretending to be something she was not. And she was so desperately tired of it, so tired of the constant vigilance required to monitor every word and gesture, so tired of watching brilliant thoughts die unspoken because speaking them would make her unsuitable, so tired of being told that everything that made her herself was somehow wrong. Frederick stood waiting, his arm not yet extended but ready, his expression patient, and she realized that he understood exactly what he was asking of her, that this was not some thoughtless, gallant gesture, but a deliberate choice to offer her a different path. "Take my arm," she heard herself say, and her voice came out stronger than she expected, clear and certain despite the trembling in her limbs. "I am done hiding." The smile that broke across Frederick's face was like sunrise after a long night, transforming his austere features into something radiant, and he extended his arm to her with a small bow that managed to be both formal and intimate. She placed her gloved hand on his sleeve, feeling the solid warmth of his arm beneath the fine fabric of his evening coat, and together they turned to face the door. He pulled it open, and the full force of the opera house's social arena crashed over them like a wave, the noise and light, and hundreds of eyes turning as one to witness the Duke of Wentworth emerging from Box 7 with the ruined Miss Arabella Fairfax on his arm. The grand corridor that circled the second tier was packed with the intermission crowd, ladies in silks and satins of every colour, jewels glittering at throats and wrists and in elaborately dressed hair, gentlemen in severe black evening clothes that somehow emphasized rather than muted their peacock displays of wealth and status. The air was thick with expensive perfumes, French scents that cost more than most people earned in a year, and beneath it, the sharp animal smell of gossip, of scandal being born and fed and allowed to grow into legend. Every head turned, every conversation stopped mid-sentence, and the whispers began like wind through dry leaves, rustling and growing, until they became a roar. "The Duke of Wentworth," someone breathed, the words carrying in the sudden hush. "With Arabella Fairfax. But she has been ruined." Another voice, louder, less concerned with discretion. "They were locked in that box together for nearly 20 minutes. What could possibly have been happening?" And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a different tone entirely. "Perhaps His Grace sees something we have all missed." Frederick stood utterly still for a moment, allowing the crowd to absorb the scene, allowing their shock to register and their speculation to begin. And then he began to walk, his stride measured and authoritative, the crowd parting before him, not out of deference to Arabella, but out of instinctive respect for his rank and bearing. Arabella felt the trembling intensify as they moved through the gauntlet of stares and whispers, felt her knees threatening to buckle, but Frederick's hand came down to cover hers where it rested on his arm, warm and steady and solid, anchoring her to this moment and this choice. His touch was gentle, but his grip was firm, and she understood that he would not let her fall, that he would support her through this ordeal, even as he demanded that she walk through it with her head high. They navigated past clusters of gossiping matrons whose fans snapped open and shut like the beaks of hungry birds, past young ladies who stared with expressions ranging from envy to horror, past gentlemen who studied Frederick with calculation in their eyes, as though trying to determine whether his associations with scandal would diminish his political power, or perhaps, perversely, enhance it. And then, inevitably, they came face to face with Lord Thomas Gardiner and Miss Lydia Fairfax, who stood near the grand balustrade with several other members of their party, their expressions of triumph from earlier in the evening transforming into something quite different as they registered the sight before them. Lydia's face was a study in conflicting emotions, guilt and triumph warring for dominance, her china blue eyes wide and her rosebud mouth forming a perfect O of shock. She was lovely in the way that society valued, all golden curls and delicate features and an air of fragile femininity that promised compliance and admiration, everything that Arabella was not and could never be. But looking at her now, Arabella felt no envy, only a distant pity for a girl who had been taught that her value lay entirely in being inoffensive, in never challenging or questioning or demanding more than the narrow role society had prescribed for her. Lord Gardiner's reaction was far less ambiguous, his handsome face flushing with rage and embarrassment, his jaw clenching so tightly that Arabella could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He took a step forward as though to block their path, his hand half raised in protest or perhaps command, but Frederick simply continued walking with such calm authority that Gardiner was forced to step aside or be walked through. At the last moment, however, Frederick paused, turning to face the man who had humiliated Arabella so publicly just an hour before, and when he spoke his voice carried clearly through the corridor, pitched perfectly to be heard by the dozens of witnesses who had gone utterly silent to catch every word. "Gardiner," Frederick said, his tone cordial but with an edge of ice beneath the politeness, "I must thank you for your spectacular lack of judgment. You have saved Miss Fairfax from a life of being undervalued." The words hit like a slap, delivered with such precision and public clarity that there could be no mistaking their intent, and Arabella watched as Lord Gardiner's face went from red to white and then to a mottled purple that suggested he was on the verge of apoplexy. "Your Grace," he sputtered, his usual eloquence deserting him in the face of Frederick's calm demolition. "Surely you cannot mean to associate yourself with... He gestured vaguely at Arabella, as though her very presence defied description, as though she were some exotic and possibly dangerous creature that had wandered into polite society by mistake. With a woman of superior intellect and principle, Frederick finished for him, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous that sent a shiver down Arabella's spine. "I assure you, I do. And I suggest you guard your next words carefully, Gardener. Miss Fairfax has agreed to sit with my family this evening. I trust you will find this arrangement suitable, as you have made your own preferences quite clear." The emphasis on the word preferences was subtle but unmistakable, a reminder that Gardiner had publicly chosen Lydia and therefore had no standing to object to Frederick's choice of companion. The crowd around them had pressed closer now, no longer even pretending not to listen, their faces avid with the thrill of witnessing a confrontation between two powerful men over a woman who by all rights should have slunk away in shame. But Arabella was not slinking, was standing straight and tall beside Frederick, her hand still on his arm, her chin raised in defiance of every expectation. She could see the calculations running behind Gardiner's eyes, the realization that challenging the Duke of Wentworth in public would be social and possibly political suicide, that whatever had happened in Box 7, Frederick's choice to claim Arabella so openly meant that opposing him would carry consequences Gardiner was not prepared to face. The moment stretched, taut as a wire, and then Gardiner stepped back with a jerky bow that conveyed fury barely, restrained. "Your Grace," he said through gritted teeth. "Miss Fairfax." And then he turned on his heel and stalked away, dragging poor Lydia with him, her golden curls bouncing as she cast one last confused glance over her shoulder at the cousin she had supplanted and the Duke who had just rewritten the entire narrative of the evening. The crowd erupted in whispers the moment Gardiner was out of earshot, the speculation rising to a fever pitch, and Frederick resumed walking as though nothing of consequence had occurred, guiding Arabella through the throng with the same steady confidence he had displayed throughout. They climbed the stairs to the center tier where the most prominent boxes were located, each step taking them higher into the stratosphere of London society. And Arabella was aware of eyes following their progress, of fingers pointing and fans fluttering, and the constant susurrus of gossip that would by tomorrow morning have transformed this evening into legend. Box 3 stood at the very center of the tier, the most visible and therefore most prestigious location in the entire opera house, a position reserved for royalty and the highest nobility, and standing at its entrance was a woman who could only be Frederick's sister. Lady Henrietta Brandon was perhaps 30 years old, tall and elegant with the same aristocratic features as her brother, but softened by warmth that radiated from her smile. She wore deep blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes, and as Arabella and Frederick approached, she stepped forward with her hands extended in welcome, no trace of judgment or disapproval in her expression. "Miss Fairfax?" she said warmly, her voice carrying the same cultured tones as Frederick's, but with a musical quality that suggested laughter always lurking just beneath the surface. "My brother has spoken of nothing but your speech on education for 3 weeks. I am delighted you have finally been properly introduced. Please, join us." The simple kindness of the greeting after the gauntlet of stares and whispers nearly undid Arabella's composure, tears pricking at her eyes as she allowed Henrietta to draw her into the box. Inside, the space was larger and more luxuriously appointed than Box 7, with velvet cushions in deep burgundy and gilt moulding that caught the candlelight and threw it back in warm reflections. Several other people were already seated, members of Frederick's family and close circle, and they rose as Arabella entered, their faces registering surprise but, following Henrietta's lead, arranging themselves into expressions of welcome rather than censure. Frederick guided her to a seat at the front of the box, the most visible position, and took the chair beside her, his presence a bulwark against the stares she could feel boring into her back from every direction. Below, the stage was prepared for the final act, the curtain still down, but the orchestra tuning their instruments in preparation, though Arabella suspected that very few people in the audience would be paying attention to Verdi tonight, not when the real drama was unfolding in the boxes above. Henrietta settled on Arabella's other side, creating a protective formation that was subtle but unmistakable, and leaned close to murmur so that only Arabella could hear. "You are braver than you know, my dear. What Frederick has just done, what you have just done, it will change everything. The scandal will be enormous, but it will also force people to choose sides, and you may be surprised by who stands with you. Not everyone in society is as narrow-minded as Gardiner and his ilk. Some of us have been waiting for someone to challenge the tyranny of convention." Arabella turned to look at this woman who was offering alliance to a stranger. This sister, who had apparently listened to Frederick speak of her for 3 weeks and decided that anyone who could inspire such devotion in her notoriously reclusive brother was worth defending. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You do not know me. You have no reason to." Henrietta smiled and patted her hand. "I know that you made my brother feel something again," she said simply. "For years he has been going through the motions of life, managing estates and attending Parliament and doing his duty, but there has been no joy in it, no passion. Then he came home from the Pemberton salon and talked for 2 hours about a woman who quoted Wollstonecraft and refused to be silenced. I have not seen him so animated in a decade. That is reason enough." The lights in the opera house began to dim, signaling the start of the final act, and the audience reluctantly settled into their seats, though the buzz of conversation did not diminish. Arabella sat in the most prominent box in the Royal Opera House, the Duke of Wentworth on one side and his sister on the other, aware that hundreds of eyes were upon her, that her name was being spoken in every corner of the theatre, that by tomorrow morning all of London would know that the ruined Miss Arabella Fairfax had emerged from a locked box with the Duke and been escorted to sit with his family in a public declaration that could mean only one thing. 3 weeks had passed since that night at the opera, 3 weeks during which Arabella and Frederick's courtship had become the scandal of the season, dissected in every drawing room and debated in every gentleman's club, the subject of countless letters and morning calls and shocked pronouncements about the decline of proper behaviour. The Duke of Wentworth's library had become their sanctuary during this siege, a room lined floor to ceiling with books that spoke of worlds beyond London's narrow confines, leather-bound volumes on philosophy and science and literature that Frederick had collected over years of searching for minds that matched his own. The afternoon light streamed through tall windows that faced the garden, creating bars of gold across the Turkish carpet with its intricate patterns of crimson and deep blue, and the air smelled of old paper and tobacco and the faint sweetness of the tea that Henrietta had ordered, brought up an hour ago. Arabella sat in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace, where a small fire burned against the April chill, a copy of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty open in her lap, while Frederick stood by the windows reading passages from a parliamentary report on education reform, his voice animated as he pointed out the flaws in the committee's reasoning. Henrietta occupied the settee near the door, ostensibly reading but actually serving as chaperone, her presence a concession to propriety that Frederick insisted upon even as he flouted every other social convention by receiving Arabella nearly every afternoon for the past 2 weeks. It had been a peaceful interlude, these stolen hours of conversation where Arabella could speak freely without fear of censure, where her opinions were not just tolerated but actively sought, where she and Frederick could debate philosophy and politics and literature with a passion that left them both exhilarated. But the peace shattered like crystal against stone when the library door burst open without warning, and Arabella's father, Lord Fairfax, strode in with the force of righteous fury, his face florid with anger and embarrassment, his eyes blazing with a mixture of shame and determination. Behind him came Arabella's mother, Lady Fairfax, her face pale and her hands twisting in anxiety, her eyes already brimming with tears. Following them was Arabella's uncle, her father's elder brother, a stern man who had always disapproved of her bookish tendencies. And then, most devastatingly, Frederick's own mother, the Dowager Duchess of Wentworth, a tall, elegant woman in her 60s, whose aristocratic features were set in lines of cold disapproval. Several other relatives crowded in behind them, aunts and cousins and family connections, until the library that had felt so spacious and peaceful moments before became oppressively crowded, the air thick with judgment and the weight of familial authority. Arabella rose instinctively from her chair, the book sliding from her lap to the floor with a thud that seemed too loud in the sudden tension, her spine stiffening as her father's gaze fell upon her like a physical blow. Frederick set down his parliamentary report with deliberate care and moved to stand beside her, his tall frame radiating controlled fury, every muscle taut with the effort of restraining himself from ordering these invaders out of his private sanctuary. Henrietta had risen as well, one hand on the bell-pull beside the door, ready to summon servants if necessary. Her expression transformed from relaxed contentment to alert wariness. Lord Fairfax wasted no time on pleasantries, his voice booming in the enclosed space as he addressed his daughter as though Frederick were not even present. "Arabella, this folly must end. You have shamed our family. Enough! Lord Gardiner has generously agreed to overlook this indiscretion if you apologize publicly and retire to our country estate." The words were so absurd, so utterly disconnected from reality, that Arabella almost laughed. Gardiner, who had publicly humiliated her by announcing his engagement to her cousin from the opera stage, had generously agreed to overlook her indiscretion in being courted by a duke. The logic was so twisted that it revealed the depth of her father's desperation to restore what he perceived as family honor, his willingness to sacrifice his daughter's happiness to the idol of social respectability. "I will not apologize for being courted by a man who values my mind, father," Arabella said, and was pleased that her voice came out steady and clear despite the trembling in her limbs. "And I will not hide." Her hand found Frederick's instinctively, their fingers intertwining in a gesture of solidarity that did not escape the notice of their assembled families. Lord Fairfax's face darkened further, if such a thing were possible, and he took a step forward as though he might physically drag his daughter away. But the Dowager Duchess raised one gloved hand in a gesture that commanded attention, her cold blue eyes sweeping over Arabella with an appraisal that made her feel like livestock being assessed for purchase. "My dear girl," the Dowager said, her voice cultured and reasonable, which somehow made her words more cutting than if she had shouted. "You must understand. Frederick requires an heir. You are 28. The risks at your age, the complications that might arise. Surely you see that a younger woman would be more suitable for." Frederick cut in before his mother could finish, his voice like steel, hard and unforgiving in a way that Arabella had never heard from him before. "Mother, you will not speak of Miss Fairfax as though she were a broodmare. Her age is irrelevant to me." The Dowager's eyebrows rose in surprise at her son's tone, clearly unaccustomed to being contradicted so directly, but she rallied quickly, her expression shifting from false kindness to genuine concern. "Frederick, be reasonable. She is outspoken, past her prime, and now thoroughly scandalous. You could have anyone. Any young woman of good family and proper breeding. Think of your duty to the line, to the family name. Every young lady in London would be honored to." "Anyone," Frederick interrupted again, his hand tightening around Arabella's in a grip that was almost painful, but felt like an anchor keeping her grounded in the face of this assault. "Yes, I have heard this argument from every corner of London for the past 3 weeks. I could have anyone, meaning I could have any vapid, compliant girl who would agree with everything I say and never challenge me and produce heirs on schedule like a well-trained mare. And I have chosen. Arabella Fairfax is the most extraordinary woman I have ever encountered. If this family cannot see her worth, that speaks to your poverty of vision, not hers." The words rang through the library like a bell, clear and uncompromising, and Arabella felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from gratitude or the sheer relief of having someone defend her so absolutely she could not say. Arabella's mother had been silent throughout this exchange, standing slightly behind her husband with tears now streaming down her face. her hands still twisting in that anxious gesture that Arabella recognized from childhood. She loved her daughter, Arabella did not doubt that, but she was terrified for her, terrified of what would become of a woman who defied society so openly, who threw away respectability for the uncertain promise of love. Arabella's uncle stepped forward now, his face set in stern lines of patriarchal authority, addressing Frederick directly with the kind of blunt pragmatism that had made him successful in business, if not in personal relationships. "Your Grace, think of your legacy, your line. A younger woman could give you many children, ensure the succession. Miss Fairfax is, forgive me for speaking plainly, nearly past childbearing age. The risks she mentioned are very real. And beyond that, her outspoken nature, her scandalous behavior at that salon, her refusal to conform to proper feminine conduct, these are not qualities that make for a suitable duchess. Surely you must see that passion, however genuine, is a poor foundation for a marriage that will impact not just your personal happiness, but the future of one of England's great families." Frederick released Arabella's hand, and she felt a moment of panic, a fear that he was stepping away. But instead he turned to face her, taking both her hands in his and raising them between them in a gesture that was both protective and declarative. His grey-blue eyes met hers with such intensity that the rest of the room seemed to fade, the angry relatives and the oppressive atmosphere and the weight of their judgment all becoming background noise to this moment of connection between them. Then he turned back to face the assembled families without releasing her hands, his posture making it clear that they were united, that any attack on her was an attack on him, that there would be no separating them, no matter what arguments or threats were deployed. "My legacy will be a partnership of equals," Frederick said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded vast estates and influenced parliamentary decisions, a man who had never in his life been successfully challenged by his social inferiors and did not intend to start now. "My line will be strengthened by her brilliance, by the intelligence and courage that she will pass to our children along with whatever other qualities they may inherit. And if you cannot understand that, if you cannot see that I would rather have 5 years of genuine partnership with Arabella Fairfax than 50 years of comfortable mediocrity with a suitable bride, then I invite you all to leave my home." The room erupted in protest, voices overlapping in a cacophony of objection and pleading and outrage. Lord Fairfax was sputtering about disinheritance and family disgrace. Arabella's uncle was invoking duty and responsibility. Several of the aunts and cousins were adding their voices to the chorus of disapproval, and through it all, the Dowager Duchess remained silent, her cold blue eyes fixed on her son with an expression that Arabella could not quite read, something between disappointment and grudging respect. Henrietta's hand had moved to actually grip the bell-pull now, ready to summon the servants to escort these people out if Frederick gave the word, her loyalty to her brother absolute even in the face of their formidable mother. Lady Fairfax had sunk onto the settee near the door, overcome by the drama unfolding before her, her tears flowing freely now as she watched her daughter stand hand in hand with the Duke, while her husband threatened and blustered and made everything worse with his intransigence. The afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed harsh now rather than golden, illuminating every line of anger and fear and judgment on the faces arrayed around the library, and Arabella was aware of her reticule sitting on the side table, where she had set it upon arrival, her gloves folded neatly beside it, evidence of the peaceful afternoon that had been so violently interrupted. Above the mantel, the portrait of Frederick's late father watched the scene with painted eyes that seemed to hold some mixture of amusement and approval, and Arabella found herself wondering what this man would have thought of his son's choice, whether he would have stood with the dowager in demanding a suitable bride, or with Frederick in choosing love and partnership over convention. Frederick raised his voice to cut through the chaos, the command in his tone silencing the protests as effectively as a conductor's baton halting an orchestra. "And if you require an announcement to make this clear," he said, his words falling into the sudden quiet like stones into still water, I intend to marry Miss Fairfax, with or without your blessings." The declaration hung in the air, transforming everything in an instant. This was no longer speculation or courtship or scandal to be managed. This was an explicit statement of intent from the Duke of Wentworth that he would wed the outspoken, scandalous 28-year-old Miss Arabella Fairfax, regardless of what anyone in this room or in London society thought about it. Arabella felt the world tilt on its axis, heard her mother's gasp and her father's strangled sound of protest, saw the dowager's face freeze in an expression of utter shock. Frederick had not proposed to her, not in the formal sense, had not yet knelt before her with a ring and asked for her hand in marriage, but he had just declared his intention to do so before both their families in terms that left no room for misunderstanding or hope, that he might be dissuaded. Lord Fairfax found his voice first, his face now purple with apoplectic rage. "You will do no such thing!" he roared, pointing an accusing finger at his daughter. "Arabella, I forbid this union. You will return home with us immediately, and you will end this unsuitable association. If you refuse, if you persist in this shameful behavior, I will have no choice but to disown you. You will have no dowry, no family support, nothing. You will be completely cut off." The threat was meant to terrify, to force compliance through financial and social pressure, but Arabella felt something shift inside her, the last chains of filial obedience snapping like threads. She had spent her entire life seeking her father's approval, moderating her behavior and hiding her intelligence, and trying desperately to be the daughter he wanted rather than the woman she was. And it had never been enough. It would never be enough, because the version of herself that he would approve of did not actually exist, was a fiction that she could never successfully embody, no matter how hard she tried. "I am sorry, Father," she said, and meant it despite everything. Sorry for the pain this was causing him, even as she refused to sacrifice herself to prevent it. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. 2 months had passed since that siege in the library. 2 months during which the battle lines had been drawn and redrawn, families had taken sides or withdrawn in disapproval, and London society had watched with avid fascination as the Duke of Wentworth and Miss Arabella Fairfax continued their scandalous courtship despite every obstacle placed in their path. Lord Fairfax had made good on his threat of disinheritance, cutting Arabella off completely and forbidding any member of the family from communicating with her, though her mother had defied this edict by sending secret letters filled with tears and recriminations and desperate pleas that Arabella reconsider before it was too late. The Dowager Duchess had withdrawn to the country in protest, declaring that she would have no part in her son's ruin, though Henrietta reported that even in her exile she was being worn down by Frederick's absolute refusal to bend, his calm insistence that Arabella was and would remain his choice, regardless of who approved or disapproved. And through it all, Arabella and Frederick had continued to meet, to talk, to build something between them that was more solid than scandal, more enduring than society's fleeting judgments, a partnership of minds and hearts that grew stronger with each passing day. On this evening in late June, as twilight painted, the London sky in shades of rose and gold, Arabella sat in a carriage beside Henrietta, heading toward a destination that Frederick had refused to reveal, despite her increasingly creative attempts to extract the information. He had sent a note that morning requesting her presence for the evening, asking her to wear her finest gown, promising her something that would, in his words, transform everything. Henrietta had arrived to collect her with a smile playing at her lips and an absolute refusal to provide any hints beyond assuring Arabella that Frederick had been planning this for weeks and that she should trust him. The carriage turned onto Bow Street, and Arabella felt her heart begin to race as she recognized where they were heading, the familiar facade of the Royal Opera House rising before them in the fading light. The last time she had been here, she had collapsed in box 7, had fainted from humiliation and heartbreak, had believed her life was ending even as Frederick was preparing to enter it and change everything. Now, as the carriage drew to a halt at the entrance, she saw that the opera house was dark, no crowds milling about the doors, no carriages lined up to discharge their glittering cargo of London's finest. Henrietta squeezed her hand and said softly, "He has rented the entire theatre for the evening, just for you." The words struck Arabella like a physical blow, stealing her breath as the full implication registered. The entire Royal Opera House, one of London's grandest venues, rented for a single evening for a private performance for an audience of 1. The extravagance was staggering, but more than that was the symbolism, the deliberate choice to return to the site of her greatest humiliation and transform it into something else entirely. Tears were already forming in her eyes as a footman opened the carriage door and helped her down, as Henrietta whispered that she would wait in the lobby, that this night was for Arabella and Frederick alone. The grand entrance hall was lit by what seemed like 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in the mirrors and gilt, until the space glowed like the inside of a jewel box, and standing at the center of it all was Frederick, resplendent in evening clothes, his grey-blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. He crossed to her in 3 long strides and took her hands in his, raising them to his lips in a gesture that was courtly and intimate at once. "You have hired an entire opera house," Arabella said, her voice already breaking with emotion, and Frederick smiled that rare smile that transformed his austere features into something radiant. "For a proposal," he confirmed, leading her toward the stairs that would take them up to the boxes. "I wanted to replace your memory of this place, to fill it with joy instead of shame." They climbed the familiar stairs to the 2nd tier, and Arabella's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest as they approached box 7, the same box where she had sat alone and collapsed, where Frederick had first locked the door and knelt before her and offered her recognition instead of pity. But the box was transformed, filled with white roses whose scent perfumed the air, the velvet cushions replaced with new ones in deep sapphire blue, and when she sat in the chair that had held her unconscious form 2 months ago, it felt like sitting in a different world entirely. Below, the orchestra was assembled in the pit, a small but perfectly formed ensemble, and as she and Frederick settled into their seats, the conductor raised his baton, and the opening strains of Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro filled the theatre. Arabella recognized the choice immediately, and felt fresh tears spring to her eyes at the perfect appropriateness of it, an opera about servants outwitting their noble masters, about wit and intelligence triumphing over rank and privilege, about love that defied social hierarchy. The performance was exquisite, the singers filling the empty theatre with voices that soared and played off each other in the intricate comedy of Mozart's masterpiece, and Arabella sat transfixed, aware of Frederick beside her, his hand finding hers in the darkness of the box, their fingers intertwining as they had so many times over the past 2 months. When the first act concluded and the curtain fell, Arabella turned to thank him for this extraordinary gift, but Frederick was already rising, offering her his hand with a smile that held both confidence and vulnerability. "Come with me," he said simply, and led her out of the box, down the stairs, not toward the exit, but toward the stage itself. They passed through a side door that led backstage, through the wings where the singers were resting between acts, and then Frederick was guiding her onto the stage itself, into the pool of golden light cast by the stage lamps that had been left burning. The vastness of the empty theatre spread before them, 3 tiers of boxes rising like layers of a wedding cake, all empty now except for box 7, where they had been sitting moments before, visible above them as a reminder of where this journey had begun. The stage was covered in white roses, hundreds of them arranged in great cascading displays that turned the space into a garden, and the scent was overwhelming, beautiful, filling her lungs with sweetness as Frederick turned to face her. Arabella's hands were trembling now, her entire body shaking with the enormity of the moment, because she understood what was about to happen, had known from the moment she stepped into the opera house that this night would transform everything. But knowing and experiencing were vastly different things. Frederick took both her hands in his touch warm and steady, despite the emotion she could see flickering in his eyes. And then, with deliberate grace, he sank to his knees before her for the second time in this theatre, but this time in the full glare of the stage lights rather than the shadows of a locked box. Nothing hidden, nothing shameful, only the two of them and the choice they were making together. "The last time I knelt to you in this place," Frederick said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. It was in shadow, with the door locked. "Tonight, I kneel in the light with all the world invited to see, though I have chosen to keep this moment for us alone." His hands released hers long enough to reach into his coat and withdraw a small package wrapped in brown paper, and when he placed it in her trembling hands, she could feel through the wrapping that it was a book. "You collapsed in this theatre, Arabella," he continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "Humiliated by small minds who could not comprehend your worth. I wanted to replace that memory, to fill this space with joy instead of shame, to show you that the place where you believed everything ended was actually where everything began." Arabella unwrapped the package with shaking fingers, the paper falling away to reveal a book bound in worn leather, the pages yellowed with age, and when she read the title embossed in fading gold on the spine, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft, she understood the full measure of what he was offering her. This was a first edition, she realized, her bibliophile's eye recognizing the publication date of 1792, a book that had been scandalous in its time and remained controversial even 66 years later, a book that had argued for women's education and equality when such ideas were considered dangerous radicalism. Frederick had given her not just a valuable artifact, but a symbol of everything they stood for together, everything they were choosing to build despite society's opposition. "I told you once that I want the woman who argued for women's education," Frederick said, and his voice was rough with emotion now, the careful control slipping to reveal the depth of his feeling. "I want the woman who quotes philosophy and challenges convention. I want my equal, my partner, my fiercest ally." He reached out and opened the book to a page he had marked with a ribbon, pointing to a passage he had underlined in pencil, and Arabella read through her tears the words that Wollstonecraft had written more than half a century ago. "I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves." "Marry me, Arabella," Frederick said, and now his voice broke completely. All pretense of aristocratic reserve abandoned in favor of raw honesty. "Marry me, and we will have power over our own lives together. We will build a partnership that defies every expectation society has tried to impose on us. We will raise children, if we are blessed with them, to value intelligence over compliance, courage over conformity, truth over tradition. We will host salons where women can speak freely and men must listen. We will use my position and resources not to maintain the status quo, but to challenge it, to make space for others who have been told they are too much or not enough. Marry me and spend your life in conversation with me, arguing with me, teaching me, growing with me. Marry me because I cannot imagine a future without you in it, because these past 2 months have shown me what partnership truly means, because you have made me believe that love and respect and intellectual communion are not separate things, but different facets of the same precious whole." Arabella was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the book to her chest with one hand and reached out to cup Frederick's face with the other, feeling the slight roughness of his evening beard beneath her gloved palm, the warmth of his skin, the realness of this man who had seen her at her lowest moment and chosen not to rescue her, but to join her, to kneel beside her in the darkness and then lead her into the light. "I never imagined," she managed to say through her tears, "after everything, after the scandal and the families and the threats and the exile, that I could be this happy, that someone would see me, truly see me, and want not to change me, but to celebrate me." Frederick turned his head to press a kiss into her palm, a gesture so tender that fresh tears spilled over, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady with absolute certainty. "Say yes, Arabella. Say yes, and I will spend every day ensuring you remain this happy, fighting beside you against every force that would try to diminish either of us, building with you a life that is ours alone to define." "Yes," she said, and the word came out as a sob and a laugh combined, all the joy and relief and overwhelming love she felt pouring out in that single syllable. "Yes, Frederick, 1,000 times yes. I will marry you and argue with you and challenge you and love you for the rest of my life." He surged to his feet and pulled her into his arms, the book pressed between them as he held her close, and she could feel his heart pounding against her chest in rhythm with her own. The orchestra, which had been silent during the proposal, suddenly burst into the triumphant finale of Figaro, the music swelling to fill the empty theatre as though the building itself were celebrating their union, and Arabella laughed through her tears at the perfect timing of it. Frederick pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness, and said, "I have a ring as well, though I confess the book seemed more important." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, the deep blue of the stone exactly the color of the new cushions in box 7, and as he slid it onto her finger, Arabella understood that every detail of this evening had been planned with meticulous care, every element chosen to transform pain into joy, shame into celebration, ending into beginning. They stood together on the stage of the Royal Opera House, surrounded by white roses and golden light, the vast empty theatre bearing witness to their promise, and Arabella looked up at box 7 visible in the darkness above them, that small gilded cage where she had collapsed in despair, and felt a profound sense of completion. The woman who had fainted in that box had been broken by society's judgment, crushed under the weight of expectations she could never meet. But the woman standing on this stage was whole, was valued, was loved exactly as she was. Frederick followed her gaze upward and seemed to understand what she was thinking, because he said softly, "From collapse to proposal, from darkness to light, from the end of one story to the beginning of another." Arabella turned back to him, this extraordinary man who had rented an opera house to replace her worst memory with her best, who had given her not jewelry but Wollstonecraft, who had knelt before her twice in this theatre, and both times offered her not rescue but recognition. "We are rewriting the rules," she said, and it was not a question but a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of what they were undertaking together. Frederick smiled and kissed her forehead, her cheeks, and finally her lips in a kiss that was both chaste and filled with promise. "We are rewriting the rules," he agreed, "and I cannot wait to see what we write next." The orchestra played on, the music of triumph and wit and love overcoming obstacles filling every corner of the great theatre, and outside the Royal Opera House, London continued its eternal motion, unaware that inside two people were making vows that would change not just their own lives, but, in small ways, the world around them. Box 7 stood empty above them, a monument to where they had been, while the stage below held them in its golden light, a celebration of where they were going. And as Arabella leaned into Frederick's embrace, the first edition of Wollstonecraft still clutched in one hand and his ring gleaming on the other, she understood that she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life without knowing it. A partner who would kneel with her in darkness and stand with her in light, who would value her mind as much as her heart, who would choose her not despite her intelligence and courage and refusal to be diminished, but because of them, and who would spend the rest of their lives together building something that society said was impossible, but they knew was simply inevitable.